So my name is Isabel Guerrero. Until a couple of months ago, I was a vice president at the World Bank. I covered South Asia. I've been working for like 31 years in the World Bank. And now I am at a process of transition in between that and whatever is emerging. I'm an economist by training, and I'm also a psychoanalyst by training.
So what we're curious about is what started you along the journey to where you are now, and maybe if you could share a particular story or a moment where you first became aware of what you really wanted to do.
Yeah. So when I was like 12 or 13 years old, my family moved from Chile to Peru. Chile is relatively rich compared to the rest of Latin America, and also very unicultural. There were not a lot of indigenous people. It was very more Spanish. And then moved to Peru, which is a very multicultural place. And the first memory that I have, which actually I always go back to, this is where my golden thread starts, is seeing this indigenous woman sitting on the pavement, and she is selling little herbs. And I remember looking at her and thinking, oh my God, she's so poor, but also she's so rich. She had this beautiful thing over her shoulders and a hat, and her dress was just beautiful. So I think it wasn't that conscious, but when I go back, that's the moment when I thought, this is what I want to dedicate my life to, which is to both improve her life, but also celebrate her beauty. So that is the moment for me.
Then what happened next?
So then, as I studied, I realized that economics was probably the best way to work on poverty. And I studied in Peru. In the Catholic University was a much more left-wing training, and then I moved for my master's to the London School of Economics, which was very neoclassical, and I learned economics in one of the best schools in the world. I had to relearn a lot, and I came out of there at around 25 and joined the World Bank, the Young Professionals Program, and for many years, for the first 10 or 15 years, I was what I call a policy wonk. I really believed in policy. Economics is a very beautiful tool in that it allows you to approach a very complex reality and simplify it. And so I really believe that if you understood incentives and the market failure, you would be able to really change the world. So I spent many years working on structural adjustment programs, first in the Philippines. When Marcos was on his way out, I did the first poverty report. I focused on macroeconomics and on poverty and inequality. That was always my focus. Then I worked on Burma, worked on Morocco, on the former Soviet Union when it was collapsing. And it was all very well until the East Asia crisis came. And I think not only me, but a lot of economists, we realized that this simple way of approaching the world was not really cutting it, in that we had left out lots of things that are really important. Institutions, for one. Second, in the former Soviet Union, I remember when we were talking to government officials, they didn't even know what a bank was. Their concept of a bank was very different. So we started to say, no, just let the private sector take care of it. Just privatize and let the private sector. And we didn't even think about governance. So for me, that was a huge lesson, because we were in such a simplistic way approaching a very complex problem that a lot of very negative results came out of that. Mafias were formed, privatization was only for a few, this incredible unequal distribution came about. So I think for me that was a moment where I thought, so how do I change the world now? This is not the magic bullet. And that's where my search continued.
So from that question, then what did you begin to explore?
So then I began to explore more the human being and the leadership story. So I began to train as a psychoanalyst. I trained for 10 years. And in the beginning, it was very much working with people who were in poverty. And I wanted to understand how, from the individual perspective, this poverty problem could be understood. And it was a beautiful experience because if you really work, this was psychoanalysis, which is on a couch 5 days a week. So if you really work with people who are committed to change, you can see huge transformation. So the first one, for example, was a Colombian guy who had been a street child in Colombia, very poor, very violent background. And then we started to work. We worked for 9 years. And he came because he wanted to commit suicide. And then little bit, because he said, I don't want to live in a world which is so violent, and I don't want to bring a child to the world which is so violent. And little by little the work continued, and the last time I heard from him, he called me from a hospital, and he said, my child has just been born. And that was the last time we met. So that personal transformation was very powerful, both with the patients that I was working, but also my own. Because to train as a psychoanalyst, you have to go through your own analysis. And so I could see how if I changed myself, I could actually start to change the world around me. And that coincided with my first management job, where I had to bring in teams, and I started very much in the top-down approach, get efficiency, get productivity mode, and then realizing that was not really bringing about the transformation that I thought was possible. And that's when I started to really invest in learning about leadership and how I had to change in order to bring about the innovation, the transformation outside that our clients were asking of us. And then I got involved in a lot of organizational change inside the World Bank. How could we become better at the task of poverty alleviation, which is the central mission of the World Bank, by changing the organization, by removing as many obstacles as possible for people who were in the front line to do their job, rather than to spend a lot of time in administration, in all these bureaucratic requirements that this very top-down system was asking of staff.
So it's so interesting because you started with the golden thread, which was so poor and so rich at the same time, went to this big kind of macro level, looking at economics, and then the personal transformation. So if you look back on that journey, what's really worked for you?
Constant exploration. I think questioning myself. It's been a constant change, which is quite demanding on people around me. I always think about my husband. It must be very demanding for somebody. I'm constantly searching. I'm constantly having a coach. I've had a coach for years and years. I'm constantly in transitions and pushing myself out of my comfort zone. And so I think I am a much richer person, but it's also quite an intense voyage. So sometimes my teams I've seen, I worked with a group of coaches in my last job for 5 years. So everybody in my management team had a coach, including myself. And then I worked with the coaches as a collective. So that we could together, both they gave me feedback, but I also said, look, this is where we're going next, please help me with this in your own individual coaching. And they told me there was a lot of pride in working in the team that I was. Everybody wanted to come. It was seen as the best team, but also there was a lot of demands that I was implicitly putting on people, that they had to grow as much as I felt I had to. So, and not everybody, is up for that. So what I'm trying to say is that it's not all great. There's a whole shadow to it that I've had to really be very conscious about.
The shadow to what specifically?
Being very demanding about personal transformation on others to develop as leaders. Yeah.
What about how has your experience as an economist informed your training as a psychoanalyst, and vice versa.
So when I applied for this psychoanalytic training, I was in interviews for a year. Nobody could understand why I wanted to become a psychoanalyst. And they were like, there's no relationship between the two. And actually, I didn't know to articulate, but I had this intuition that there was. And now I see it in a big way. So economics, first of all, is very obsolete in how it thinks about behavior. It's really psychology from the 1920s, and it's never really been updated. And I remember when I would used to question in microeconomics, what do you mean utility functions are independent? What do you mean my well-being doesn't at all depend on my neighbor's well-being? They would say, stop questioning, just study for the exam. That's what I remember. And so I always had this unease about the behavioral side of economics. And there's people who've been trying to change that. But economic profession is very resilient to change. They are not very open. So they've never, Amartya Sen, for example, has this famous book on inequality. He really questioned this idea of utility functions being independent. And he has a Nobel Prize, but his impact in the way that economics is taught, micro, macro, you don't really feel it. Micro is still taught based on these utility functions. So I think, first of all, I came from that point of view, that economics had this real weakness. And then when I studied psychoanalysis is a very strong framework. That's why I went into psychoanalysis rather than into other type of psychology. And I think it really enriched the way that I understood the world, because you have the world of macro, governments, regulation, private sector, and then you have a whole world in each person. And each person is unique, and each person has the potential to really transform. So the process of transformation that happens at the individual level is something that really helped me understand how tough it is to transform the bigger macro, because it is formed of individuals, and to change that you really need to change from a deeper space.
I want to actually move along a little bit to slightly different, maybe the present moment, which, from what I understand, you've gone into an unknown space, and I bet that's something that a lot of people would like to know more about. This, going from a place where you've had a wonderful career, you've been very accomplished, and so why step into this unknown space again, and why, and also just any insights you can give about what it's been like for you from a personal perspective to be going through this.
Yeah, it's been tough. First of all, because I jumped not quite knowing why, but I knew that was it, that this was the time. I was very aware that I had to go through a process where I had to give up external signs of power, because even though I never believed that being a vice president of the bank was about me, I knew that a lot of what I got was about the function and not about me. Still, I knew that I had to give up that. And so that is an interesting process. You step up from a place you've worked for 30 years, it's your village. It is your community, even though it has things that you are very happy that you're walking away from. But still, that is painful. So there's a whole process of letting go, which is painful, and I think it stops a lot of people from jumping, because you have to go through that. Every time that I change countries, and I've lived in a lot of countries, the first 6 months were really painful months. I left the familiar, I left my nest, and every time I was like, why am I doing this if it's so painful? And then one day I realized I'm doing it because, and this is true for now as well, I'm doing it because every time that I get out of my comfort zone, it's an opportunity to discover something really new. So right now I'm in this space, and I love this William Bridge book on transition. I'm in this neutral zone. So I'm not in the past, I've stepped out. I'm not in the future, I'm in this space in the between. So it's a space that creates a lot of anxiety, but it's also, I believe, it's the eminent creative space. That's where innovation happens, that's where creativity, that's where you really find a completely new thing that is waiting to emerge. And so that is a super rich space. I have no idea exactly what I'm going to be doing in the future, but I've been exploring things that I love that I had never had time to explore. I love abstract painting. I've gone into, oil painting, photography. So I'm just touching loves that have been like waiting for me out there to have the time to go. I've been much more present to my family. To my family's in Chile, but I've been spending more time with them, my husband. It's just been more present to life. So I'm looking forward to what's coming next.
Are there questions that have come up for you, that like questions that are maybe central to this time for you right now, that have come up since you stepped into this neutral space?
So that's the question of, so my golden thread is clear. There's a big question, which is, that picture was a picture of, I want to work so she can come out of poverty, but I also wanted to celebrate her beauty. And that's the question. What is it about that I haven't yet touched? And, I have a lot of judgment, we all have. I think about design and fashion and things like that. And that's why seeing Eileen Fisher was so good for me, because I'm very judgmental about those things. I'm like, oh, fashion, that's a horrible world. Well, maybe not. You have to open yourself to that judgment. So I don't know where it will take me, but I know that beauty I had left out, and it is in my golden thread. And I have to explore it and find where it's going to come.
Is there anything else you want to add?
No, I think life is about integrating different parts of yourself and eventually finding your authentic self. And that authentic self has a lot of dimensions. I mean, the spiritual is one. For me, integrating the feminine has been another. I was a very masculine type of leader because that's what gave me the results, and those were my role models. And then when I went to Mexico, I think I found the value of the feminine, the strength of the feminine. And so I think life is a beautiful long journey where you actually integrate different parts. And to become a leader and to be part of a transformation, you have to go through that integration. That is the leadership voyage for me. So the personal side is very important. You cannot be a leader of transformation if you're not willing to, like Gandhi said, you have to be the change that you want to see in the world. So I think that is, even though sometimes it seems difficult and you have to step out of your comfort zone and there is pain, because the first reaction people have when you have pain of leaving the familiar, the sadness or fear, the first reaction is, well, maybe I shouldn't be here. And no, that's the door. That's the door through which you have to walk if you really want, that new.
So then your advice would be to...
Don't get afraid of the pain. Don't get afraid of the unknown. Step out of your comfort zone so you can continue growing. And this is a lifelong thing. It's not just when you're younger. It continues. That's the beauty.